Welcome to this section on the basic UI of our app. I'm going to take you through the Xamarin Designer, which is new as of 2016. The Xamarin Designer allows you to lay out the graphical elements of your app in a structured manner and separates those elements from your code to make it easier for your life as an app designer. I'm going to discuss labels, text views, and text fields, the differences between them, and when you would or wouldn't use them. I'm going to give you some clues on how to change the keyboard type that gets presented to your user whenever they click a box. We're going to take an in-depth look at constraints inside of Xamarin Designer, which is quite a confusing subject, but it's actually quite easy once you understand what you're doing. I'm going to run you through auto constraints, manual constraints, and relative constraints. And the whole purpose of having constraints is so your app runs on any screen size, whether it's produced now or sometime in the future on a device that hasn't been released yet. Finally, I'm going to set you a task, which is to apply a background color whenever you click a button. We're also going to cover how you assign the click event to buttons and the different kind of events you can have around button use inside of iOS. So for example, you can click a button, slide down, and that is a completely separate event to when you just click a button. Let's have a brief overview of the Xamarin Designer for iOS storyboards. Open up Xamarin and your project, open main.storyboard, and your storyboard should show. Now, as a general concept, storyboards represent kind of scenes inside your app. The idea is taken from the sort of cartoon world where you would make storyboards as you progress through time along your story. Storyboards inside of apps represent screens as they are going to appear to the user. There's a bit more functionality in them. You can have transitions from scene to scene within a storyboard. But as a general concept, think of them as a kind of comic that tells you what's going to happen and how your app is going to flow. Before storyboards came along, we had to code everything by hand, which was a bit painful, but now that we have them, it's far easier to pop things into our app. Inside of our current storyboard, we can click this zoom icon to fit everything to our screen. We can zoom in and out using the icons next to that. At the moment, we have one item called a view controller. And if you remember previously, I told you that a view controller is effectively a scene inside of your app. We have an entry point for our app, which is over on the left-hand side. And if I click View Controller, I can scroll down in my Properties pane, and we have this item here that says Is Initial View Controller. You can click that on and off to set the initial controller. I believe if you only have one controller, it will always be the initial one, but don't take my word for it. Okay, so we have our view controller. How do we drag objects into there, or graphical elements? Over in our toolbox at the top right corner, we can scroll down and grab elements. So if I grab something like an activity indicator view, I can click and drag it and drop it in to my view controller. And I'm just going to zoom in so we can all see it a little more clearly. Now if I clicked this activity indicator and I head over to my properties section, I can set different items about it. I can also set things like identifiers and names for it. So right at the top we have a name. Let's call this activity indicator. Now, if you're coming from the iOS world and Xcode, you'll recognize the two words called outlets and actions. Outlets and actions, if you're not familiar, were where you would drag from a graphical element into your code file to create a kind of connection between the GUI and the code. Xamarin is a little bit different to that. In fact, I think it is somewhat better than how Apple does it in Xcode. Once you've named something in the identity section, click the viewcontroller.cs, expand it, and open up the designer.cs file behind it. Inside of here, you'll notice that an outlet is automatically generated by the iOS designer for our activity indicator. So if I double click the view controller, inside my view did load, I can start to reference this activity indicator and it gets automatically filled for us. This is a lot simpler than the Xcode version. So that is the basics of the storyboard section. It's the basics of how we drag controls in and how those controls, buttons, labels and things are identified by the code behind our file. Let's look at the very first element we're going to discuss, and that is a text label, or a UI label as Apple refers to it. Open up your main storyboard. Inside the toolbox, scroll down until you come to label. And when you click it, down in the properties box at the bottom right, we have the description, which is UI label, and it tells us a few more details. Click and drag that over to our view controller and drop it in. Right, once we've dropped it in and we have it selected, in the properties section at the bottom right, we can give it a name. So let's call this button label, because we're going to use it to identify a button. If we like, we can subclass this by putting our own class in, but we're not going to do that, and you'd rarely have occasion to do that actually. We also have a bunch of other settings like text. We can have plain, attributed text. We can have the actual text. So let's call this button. Let's just call this button is here. I really can't type today. Button is here. You can set a color for it, a font, alignment, etc. Lines allows you to set a set number of lines for it. Usually with a label, you would keep this at 1. Later on, using other text items, we would have more lines. You can set it enabled or disabled, and that changes it to a light grey color that tells the user that the label is not currently in use. And my Xamarin is not responding. You may find occasionally that your Xamarin crashes, and I'm afraid it's just part of the package when it comes to Xamarin. It's not great at bug handling. It crashes way more often than Xcode, I've found. And it's back. We can set other things, and some of the things I like to have with my labels is to change the background. If I want a color scheme in my app, I can change the tint of the label. I can have a dark text color. And there are many other options. Okay, so that is a basic label. Now what I'm going to do is dive a bit deeper into this Xamarin designer. If I just zoom in and I go ahead and click the button, what I would like to do is actually change the width of this button. Not only that, but I would also like to position it on my screen at a certain place. What we can do is use constraints. Up at the top of our Xamarin designer, we have this little plus button which adds the recommended constraints. And when you click that, you'll notice it's given us 4 constraints. We've got 2 long blue lines, 1 for height and 1 for width. And what this is going to do is position the button on our device screen in a relative manner that takes its cues from the size of the screen it's on. So in other words, I can set my button to be, if I click this blue line at the side here, and I click Widget under Properties, I can change this constant to 10, and that's going to move the button to 10 decimal points or pixels from the left-hand side of whatever screen it's running on. And constraints are a powerful way to make sure your items are always visible no matter the size of screen. So I'm going to click this one below it, which stands for a width, and I'm going to slowly increment this and see how big we have to make it to make everything fit. Button is here. There we go. And then I'm going to click this top one, and I'm going to make this quite close to the top, so 50 pixels from the top. We can leave the height as it is. So that's your introduction to the label inside of iOS, and don't forget that labels are used generally as their namesake to label things. And also, you've learnt how to auto-constrain things. In the subsequent lessons, we'll look at other text fields and text views that are available, and we'll learn a little bit more about constraints. In the last lesson, we created a simple label and we learnt about auto constraints and editing those. In this one, we'll look at what happens when we want to display a little more text, and for this we use something called a UI text view. So inside of our toolbox, let's scroll down. We have a text field, which isn't the one we want. We're going to cover that in the next lecture. Let's scroll up, and in fact in the toolbox let's type text, and here we have a UI text view. You'll notice that controls and data views are different sections for text views and text fields. Drag and drop a text view onto your screen. You'll notice it auto-populates a standard bit of Latin text for you. Let's give this a name. So with it selected, scroll up in your properties area and drop in a name. Let's have this as text view. Now I would like to position this text view along the bottom of my app. So what I can do is I can drag these little handles at the side here that will then expand it. Or if I click the item again, you'll notice I get these pins that appear on the side. And these allow me to add constraints. So rather than clicking the auto constraint button at the top, I can add constraints one by one. So I'm going to click this side one on the left, and I'm going to drag it over to the edge of my view controller and release. Now I'm going to click that constraint, and inside of my properties widget, I'm going to change its constant value to 10. And now you will notice that it drops a plus 98, and what it's saying is the current position doesn't reflect where it's actually going to be when you run the app. So we can ignore that for now. Let's click our item again and pin another constraint to the bottom. Let's click that one, and what I'm going to do is change that one to 10, and I'm going to do the same to the right hand side, and you guessed it, let's drop in a value there of 10. Now this needs a height. So click our object, and on the left and right hand, or rather on the right hand side and the bottom, just next to the pin constraint, we have this little I bar. And if you hover over it, it says click to pin the size of this view. When you do that, you can set a height and an aspect ratio. We'll just set the height. And when that's done, click the orange bar and set your height to any value you wish. I'm going to set this to maybe 150. Right, you'll notice in the designer that we have our text field, and just below that we have this orange outline that tells us where the text field is actually going to be. How do we update our display? Well, click anywhere in the display, up at the top, click the button that says Update Frames Based on Constraints. And let me just try and click that. There we go. So sometimes you actually have to select the element itself to actually update it. I thought it was the whole designer, and if I'm not mistaken, it used to be like that, but it is what it is now. So now all of these constraints at the side are colored blue, and this tells us there are enough constraints to position this element whenever our app is loaded, regardless of the screen size. Alright, that concludes how to manually add constraints, and you've also learnt how to create a text view. A text view is a view that you use to display a scrolling list of text that a user cannot or should not edit. So far in our app, we have a label at the top and a text view at the bottom of our screen. Now we're going to look at a third kind of text view, and this is actually called a text field. And what's the difference between the two? Well, a text view shows you some text you can scroll through. A text field allows you to enter some text as the user, and when a user clicks on it, the keyboard will automatically pop up so they can enter some data. So over in our storyboard and our toolbox, let's drag in a text field and drop it in somewhere within our view controller. We have some text already filled in. Let's click it, let's change the name, and let's call this text field. Then let's scroll down, and we have this special item here called placeholder text. So let's put in enter sentence. This placeholder text is going to show when there is no text in the box. So up inside of our text field properties, let's remove this text, and you'll notice the element actually now has a light grey background with our placeholder text in it. Let's give this label a width. So click it once, click the bar at the bottom, hit width, and let's expand its size a little bit. Let's have 150 for that one. Right, you'll notice the designer has propped its orange box at the top there, and that's because this isn't yet constrained. That's why everything is still orange. What we're going to learn in this lesson is how to constrain things relative to one another. So I want this box to actually be constrained relative to my label. So I'm just going to drag my box down, drop it wherever. I'm going to drag my pin item up to the button. I'm going to hover it over the bottom of the button. I can also set it relative to the middle or the top. And then I can click the icon that appears there, and I can change its position relative to the label. So I can drop this down a bit. Let's make this about 40. We have a width. So this is going to be positioned up at the top. It's still orange because we need one more constraint that constrains it horizontally. So let's create one that pins it over to the side of our view. Let's give it a padding of 10. Now let's update everything. And once we do that, everything should turn blue, so we know where things are going to be. On buttoners here, I'm just going to change this text to something like that. A very basic indication of where the button is. Right, so we've learnt in this section how to create a text field where our user can enter some text. We've also learnt how to constrain it relative to another element on the screen. And this is not too dissimilar to CSS if you've used that before. Okay, what if I actually wanted to have this sentence box stretch across the whole screen? Well, what I would do is I would remove the width element, so select it and just hit backspace. And it disappears, everything turns orange. Then I would pin the end of it to the other side and change that to about 10 in the constant box. There we go. So now we have a full width label to enter our sentence. In the next lecture, we're going to look at a button and how to pop that into our little app and then learn how to do something when the button is clicked. I'll give you a clue. We're going to take that sentence and we're going to drop it into the text field below, or the text view rather. Our app is really coming together now. It looks well laid out, I think. All we're missing is a button to perform some actions. Over in our toolbox, let's hit button and drag in a button from under controls. Do not drag in the bar button item. This is a special button that sits in the top navigation bar of our apps, and we're not going to cover that yet. So click the plain button, drag and drop it in, and what I'm going to do is just zoom in and I'm going to position that button relative to some other elements. I'm going to double click it first of all. Whoops, not that. I was trying to double click it to change the text, but it appears you can't do that with a button anymore, so simply select the button, come to the properties panel. First of all, let's give it a name. Let's call this simply button with a lowercase b, and then we can change the title text of it. Let's call this transport. You'll see why I've called it that in a minute. Now let's add some constraints. I'm going to pin it to the right side of the label, and I'm going to make that roughly 20. I'm also going to give it a width, so we have enough room to actually see the text on the button. Let's give it a width of about 65. That should do it. And then finally, I'm going to, whoops, I've double clicked by accident again. I am actually going to pin it to the top of my label here. And I'm just going to drop that down a little until my orange outline kind of lines up with it all. Then I'm going to click the Update Constraints button. If it works. There we go. So obviously I need a little more width on this. Let's give this a width of 80. And it's worth bearing in mind here that the smallest screen you will ever have to play with, I believe, is 320 across in width. And the smallest height is 480. And that corresponds to the old iOS devices that were 3.5 inches. Chances are you won't actually want to support the iPhone 4 or 4S for much longer. So always make sure your elements fit across the screen. So we have our button. We've given the button a name. how do we get that button to fire off some events? Well, let's open up our viewcontroller.designer, and you'll notice the button is set in there as an outlet. This just gives us a reference to the button. Okay, open up your view controller, and we want this method viewDidLoad to set our button click handler. Now, why do we set it in here? That's because viewDidLoad only loads once, regardless if it goes off screen, on screen, background, whatever. viewDidLoad only loads once. So it's the ideal place to do one-off tasks, and the following is a one-off task. We want to grab our button, touch up inside. So if I scroll down, we have these little E icons, and they tell us that these are events. And if you double click one, we can enter plus equals. We can pass it over a sender and some event arguments. Open our curly braces and close them. So this method will fire off when our button is clicked. Why are we putting it inside viewDidLoad that only loads once? That's because if I put this inside of something like viewWillAppear, that touch up inside event gets added to the button each time the view appears. So .NET doesn't say you can only have one touch event, it says you can have as many as you like. And if you put it in viewWillAppear, make the app go away, then come back, it'll add another touch event, so everything will get fired twice. I'll show you what that means by actually showing it in the simulator. Inside touch up inside, let's have console.writeLine, and let's have clicked to send ourselves a nice simple message. Let's hit play and run this on our iPhone 5 simulator. So it takes a little longer to build than Xcode does, but that's okay. So now let's hit transport, pop over to Xamarin, open our app output, and we have clicked written there. And of course that happens once each time I click it, so now there should be 3. Okay, stop that running and come back to our viewDidLoad. If we remove touch up inside and start to type touch, we have all kinds of events. So if a touch is cancelled, once the touch goes down, once the touch down is repeated, there are many events. One of my favorites is actually drag exit. So if I double click this and then hit play, the button will now behave a little bit differently. And I've used this feature before on quite a few apps. So if I click it, come over to Xamarin, there is no output. What we have to do is click and hold, drag down. And inside of application output, we have clicked. Now, why is that? That's because touch drag exit means we've held it down and exited from the button. And I say this is handy because you can use it as a selector. If you want to open a folder or something, you can click something, flick down, and something else opens. So don't be stuck with the idea of a button as a simple click item. There are many things you can do with buttons in iOS, so I'd advise you to explore all of these options. So now we have this app with a button, we've got a text field that we can enter text in, and a text view down at the bottom that displays some text. What we want to do in this lesson is when we click transport, we want to take the text inside of enter sentence, and we want to drop that text into our UI text view. We also want to get rid of this keyboard, because you'll notice nothing I do seems to get rid of it. So we'll look at that as well. Head on over to Xamarin. Let's change our button event to the classic touch up inside. Let's remove this console write line clicked. Right, the first thing we have to do is actually transport the text inside of our text field. So we have to make sure that we reference the correct text field. Open up main storyboard, click this text field, and note the name is called text field. Come back to view controller. With the button, type text field, and then we can grab the text out of it by saying .text. So let's assign that to the text view. Let's type text view .text is equal to text field .text, and this will grab it and assign it. Then we want to take away the text from our text field. So let's say text field .text is equal to empty quotation marks, and this will remove all of it. Okay, let's hit play and see what happens. And it's not going to be great, and I'm going to explain why in a second. We'll enter our sentence, hit transport. It's now moved to the text view down below, but we can't see the text view. So how do we get rid of this keyboard when we click the button? Create a new line inside of your button and type text field dot. And the special method we're looking for is resign first responder. And this will remove the keyboard from our view. Let's hit play and see if that actually works. Let's type a sentence. Grant is awesome. Hit transport. Sentence is transported and our keyboard disappears. Well, you've successfully created an app that transfers some text from one bit to another. Let's add some really cool niceties to this. Inside of our view did load, before the button touch up inside, let's have our text field dot keyboard type equal to UI keyboard type dot. And in here we can force our user to have only a certain kind of keyboard. So I can drop an email address keyboard if I wish, and when I hit play, it's going to present us with a keyboard that allows the user to have the @ key within easy reach. So I'll enter that sentence, and look, we have the @ key down here. Some other keyboard types that you might want to use: if you were asking for a phone number, you could have a number pad. And this is all really useful to know if you have a registration form within your app, just to streamline the whole process. So now I have a number app, and it will only allow me to enter these numbers. And if I hit transport, again, the keyboard is resigned. Okay, that is the basic idea behind our app. It's very simple, but this concept of labels, text fields, buttons, and events is what you need to really get going with your app development. Here's a little challenging task for all of you. What I want you to do is, when you enter a sentence with whatever keyboard type and you click transport, I would like you to change the background color of the entire screen. I'll give you a clue. The entire screen is called the view. And you're going to change that background color to a random color inside of your view controller. So have a think, have a play, and please don't go to the next lecture until you've had a go at it. In the last lecture, I set you a little task, and that was to change the background color of the main screen of our app to a random color every time you click the transport button. So this lecture is going to cover the solution to that task. The first thing we're going to do is copy everything inside button touch up inside. Actually, we're going to cut it, and then we're going to change our button touch up inside. We're going to remove all this and hit plus equals, put a space, and you'll notice Xamarin says I can create a method stub for you called button touch up inside. Double click that, and Xamarin creates a completely separate method to help keep our code organized and clean. Now paste what we were going to do inside of there. Underneath that bit of text, we are going to have code to change color. Let's have view. Remember, I gave that to you as a clue. The view represents the first layer of the entire view that we see in our app. Dot background color, and if we hover over background color, it tells us this is a UI color. So let's make this equal to UI color dot red, for example. So let's hit play, and now when we click the button, our text will get transported and the view's background color will be red. And there we have it. And now that we've changed the background color, we can notice a few things. The background to a button is clear, same with the label, but text view and text field are set as white. So always bear that in mind with your app, because if you have a background and then you have a sudden jarring transition to just a white background, it doesn't look that great. So always test your GUI and test often. Right, that's not the complete task that I asked you to do. I asked you to change to a random color each time. So inside of here we need a little function to grab a random color and assign it to our view. If we remove this red color and start typing from, there are different ways of specifying colors, and this is applicable across all of the UI elements in iOS. We can select from RGB, and this allows us to have integers, floats, or bytes to set values of red, green, and blue. So it expects 3 values. We can give it a 0.1 F for float, a 0.5 F for green, and a 0.9 F for blue. And now if we hit play, that should give us a fairly bluish greeny color. When I click the button, and we have a blue color. Right, stop that running. So how do we get these into random numbers? Well, it's simple enough. Let's create 3 variables. So var rand1 is equal to, we're going to grab a new random. Then once we've got that random seed value, let's hit next double. And then we can copy that line and create a rand2 and a rand3. This isn't the only way to do randoms, of course. You can do it any which way you please. But for now, we'll use this. Then inside here, we're going to drop in the rand1, the rand2, and the rand3. Now when I hit compile, this is going to give me an error. And the error will be a type mismatch. We cannot assign doubles to system floats because the view background color expects a float and the random is returning a double. We can explicitly convert this to a float. So in brackets before the command, let's have float. And what this does is grab the double and create a float out of it. Now when we hit play, that should work well. It's all built, and every time we hit the button, we should get a new random color for our background. You may be asking, why is the color gray? And the answer is simple. Over here, inside of Studio, where we created these randoms, every time you create a new random, like I said, I believe it uses the system clock. These 3 lines of code execute so fast that it uses that system clock random seed variable in quick succession to the previous one, which means that this random number tends to be the same. So let's try something a little different. Let's call this var rand seed is equal to a new random. Then let's use that rand seed to actually grab our next double. So we've only created this random class once, or this random variable, and each time we call it, we're saying I would like the next one, rather than recreating the same random class because it's so close in time. Let's hit play and see if we actually get a color coming out of this. I hope so, because it's the first time I've done this on this app. Hit transport. There we go. And we have many, many colors. Any random color you can think of, we have now created it. Okay, so that's the solution to your little task. You've learnt how to change the color of practically any element inside of a view in iOS. This is going to apply to text views, to backgrounds, to text colors. Wherever you have a color object, you can do things like this. You've reached the end of this section on basic UI elements and the Xamarin Designer Part 1. You've learnt the difference between labels, text views, and text fields. You've learnt how to change the keyboard type that gets presented to your user whenever they click a text field. You've also learnt how to use buttons, how to assign click events to buttons, and also the various events that iOS can assign to buttons, like touching and sliding or holding down, things like that. I showed you how to create constraints in your designer, whether those are auto-generated, they are manually generated, or they're generated in a relative manner to other elements on your screen. You did that because you want your graphical elements to appear on a range of screen sizes, whether those screen sizes exist already or they exist in the future. So in a way, it's a great way to future-proof your app. Finally, I set you a task which was to apply a random background color to the main view of our app every time the transport button was clicked. I showed you in a separate lecture how to actually achieve that, and inside of that you learnt that you can assign colors using the RGB red, green, blue to almost any element inside of iOS.